Tell me if you agree or not, but we live in a culture that is a bit obsessed with fear. Okay, don't tell me whether you agree or not.
I agree.
Thank you very much. At times it's true. As we sit here today, there are over, I've shared this before, but I'll share it again, over 500 listed phobias in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. And quite frankly, from what I understand, it doesn't take much to add one. If you come up with a fear, they generally just find a Latin word that meets the bill and then add phobia to it. For instance, some of these you might know. It's quiz time, right? Arachnophobia, fear of spiders. Hydrophobia, fear of water. Dentophobia. Anybody know? Me! Actually, are you afraid of dentists, Ashley? Yeah. That's what dentophobia is. I've got it bad. Dentophobia, right? Some of these things verge on the ridiculous, and apologies if you have these diagnoses, but barophobia, it's the fear of gravity. I don't know. This one always makes me laugh. Genuphobia, it's the fear of knees. I don't get, and then the one that always gets me, phobophobia. The fear of fear. A fear. It seems a bit cyclical, right? And the reality of things. I mean, listen, I really don't want to poke fun. This is real stuff for real people. I really struggled as a kid with the fear of the dark, and the fear of the guy that lived under my bed, and the fear of my big brother who lived across the hall, right? But I bring it up because fear is a real thing. And it's a real thing in the Bible. And actually what I'd like to talk about this morning. If you're just joining us, we're in a series using a book written by R.C. Sproul back in the 80s entitled The Holiness of God. I hope you're enjoying the book. Many of you have shared just really great remarks. Maybe you wouldn't share the remarks that you don't like it, but many of you have shared the remarks that you have and have benefited from it. But we're using that book and walking through a summer series on the holiness of God. And we're talking about the holiness of God because it's a year that we're talking about transformation, and we believe that talking about the holiness of God will bring transformation in our lives as we better understand who God is. And this morning, I want us to talk about fear. The chapters we've read this week is the trauma of holiness. And I wonder if the holiness of God elicits fear in any of us. If the holiness of God elicits fear in any of us. And maybe the better question is, should it? Should it? You know, the Bible talks about fear. First, and the Bible often says, what about fear? It says to do not fear, right? We see it time and time again. I need to clear something up, though. I've seen the meme a number of times, or the Instagram entry, or the Facebook entry that says, you know, in the Bible there are 365 times where it says, do not fear, one for every day. If that has blessed you, continue in the blessing. But it ain't true. Right? So I hate to burst your bubble. There's probably about 170 times, even if you stretch it a bit, where the idea of not fearing is in the Bible. So I don't know, that's one for every 6 months if you're helping with that, right? You can go back and do it again. But the reality is that it does say that we are not to fear. Most of the time, that's when the world is presenting something that is overwhelming. And God says, because God is greater, you need not fear. Exodus chapter 14, verse 13 is one of those places the people of God are at the Red Sea. They're stopped by the Red Sea. Egypt is coming behind them. And Moses said to the people, what? Fear not. And they all said, easy for you to say. Moses said, I don't know if I said that or not. Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. So when the world throws something at the people of God, often God shows up in some way, some form, through someone, and says, fear not. Or, listen, even when God shows up in some manner and says, do not fear, because quite frankly, the presence of God is scary. We have those occasions as well. Luke chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 says, and an angel, remember this text, right? This is when Jesus is about to be born, and the shepherds are out in their fields watching their flocks by night, and angel of the Lord appears to them, and glory of the Lord shone around them. So here's God in all of his brilliance and all of his might, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said, fear not, right? For behold, I bring you good news, a great joy that will be for all people, that in the city of David tonight a child is born, who is Christ the Lord. So notice that the power of God, in one sense, gives us reason not to fear. You still with me? Second, sometimes the Bible suggests that more fear would be healthy. So sometimes he says, fear not. Sometimes he says, more fear would be healthy. Maybe the most familiar of this would be Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. Right? You know this, you've heard this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. That indeed there might be health, right? There might be goodness in fearing God more. And Jeremiah 32, which may not be as familiar to you, verses 39 through 40, Jeremiah is talking about God's covenant promises, and he says this, I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me. Hear that? Positive, healthy, fear me forever, for their own good and the good of their children after them. I will make with them an everlasting covenant, that I will not turn away from doing good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts. If God's doing something to put something in our hearts, it's good, right? It's healthy. I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. So who's confused? You know, should we fear or not fear? Kind of sounds like Shakespeare a bit, right? Let me confuse you a bit more before I try to make sense of it. Exodus chapter 20. I think this helps us a ton. Exodus chapter 20 provides us with some help, I think. The people of God, if you remember Exodus 20, right? The people of God are gathered at Mount Sinai. And there is probably very few instances in the Bible or scenarios in the Bible that are more scary than what they experience. The mountain is trembling, there's fire, there's smoke, there's all kinds of craziness happening, and God is showing up. And in verse 18, I'll get to verse 20, it's on your screen. It says, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid, and they trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. And then Moses said this to the people, listen, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. It's one place in the Bible where it uses both. Don't fear, God is here. Right? But you should probably fear the reality of the fact that God is here. There's a reverence, right? That is built in. Is anyone searching for a simple explanation to all of this? Well, let me try to help. I think we hear Moses here say, don't let the overpowering nature of God push you away. Don't be like the people that says, I don't want God, right? Don't let the overwhelming power of God push you away. Rather, allow, listen, his holiness to be the very thing that draws you in with absolute reverence of who he is. I'll say it again. Don't let the overpowering nature of God push you away. Rather, allow his holiness to be the very thing that draws you in with absolute reverence, fear of who he is. Is it possible that if we were more filled with a healthy fear of God, and drawn in reverence to his presence, that we might be less afraid of the things the world throws at us. If we were more filled with a healthy fear, we might be less afraid of the worldly fears. That a fear of God might make us actually less afraid. That when we cry out for help in our fear of the world, that God might actually be saying, "Come, know me more. But be ready, while that is good, it's not necessarily safe." How do we develop that in our lives? It's good for the preacher to say it. You might even be a good Baptist today, say amen. I think that's a great point. But how actually does that work in our lives? Well, I'd like to steal a bit from Sproul in this chapter to follow a reverse transformation of the Apostle Peter. And I think in it we will see ourselves a bit and hopefully learn a bit. So as you can see this morning, not one spot in the Bible that we're expositing today, but we're all over the place. In fact, as we look at Peter quickly, we will be in all 4 of the Gospels. So you ready for a journey? Maybe just kind of settle in and think about this, but I would encourage you maybe to take notes of the references and go back today and begin to look more into this reverse transformation of Peter in these verses. The first that I point to, great story of the calling of Peter. In Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. You might remember this story. These are stories that we learned on flannel graphs in Sunday school when they had flannel graphs in Sunday school, right? In doing that. But let me paraphrase it a bit to tell it this morning. But yeah, maybe go back and read it as you go this week. Peter is a professional fisherman, probably known actually for his expertise as a fisherman. And one day after fishing all night, they were wrapping up, they were cleaning their nets, they were cleaning their boats, a tedious task. And Jesus steps out of the crowd. And probably Jesus is someone that Peter has known, maybe even met, but indeed is still not a disciple, right? So he's still doing his fisherman job. But Jesus steps out of the crowd. The crowd is huge, and really for amplification purposes and for practical purposes, Jesus steps out of this crowd and says, "Hey Peter, can I use your boat? Let's just pull away from the land a little bit. I need to teach this people." And so Peter, in respect of who Jesus is, thinking that his cleaning of his boat and his nets are done, "Sure, Jesus, I would love to." And so Peter grabs the boat, and Jesus and them just pull a few yards away into the water in order to teach the people. And I imagine that Peter sat spellbound, right, on the teachings of Jesus in that moment. Was growing in his respect, maybe his intrigue of the reality of who Jesus is and what it was that he was saying. However, when Jesus was done, they had conflict. They needed Larry's class, right? Starting August 4th. They had conflict. Because what did Jesus say? Jesus said, "Peter, this is what I want you to do. I want us to go out into deeper waters. I want you to put down your nets and let's catch some fish." We're not told, but I think Peter said, "First, Jesus, I'm the fisherman. Like, we've been doing this all night. We haven't caught a dang thing, right? And so you're the teacher. You stick to teaching. I'll stick to fishing. We'll be okay. I'll take you to shore. You can go to the next village. We're good, right?" And there's a sense in which we're even told that. Like, he says, "Listen, we toiled all night and didn't catch a thing." And I think Jesus just gave him one of those looks. And he goes, okay. And so they go and they push out into deeper waters. They lower the nets, and you know the story, right? That the fish just jumping into the net. The net is filled. They bring the net up. The boat is filled. The boat begins to sink. They call their buddies James and John over. Say, "Hey, can you bring us another boat?" They fill that boat. That boat's about to sink. And then all of a sudden, Peter has a brilliant idea. It says this right in the scriptures. I'm sure you've read it. He pulls out a contract and he goes, "Dude, you are good for business. If you sign right here, you can go with me on every fishing expedition, fill these nets, man, we'll make a bunch," right? Peter says, let me use you for my prosperity. That's exactly what I want to do, right? Is that the story? No. I mean, it's obvious that Peter didn't have what that was, geniophobia, because the Bible tells us that he fell at Jesus' knees. That was supposed to be funny. Come on. Thank you, Ashton. Listen, he falls at Jesus' knees. And he says what? Away from me. For I am a sinner. It's that Isaiah moment, right? When Isaiah, we saw a couple of weeks ago, sees the presence of God. He says, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips, among a people of unclean lips. This is where Peter is. Man, woe is me. You need to get away from me. You are way, well, I'm a sinner. I cannot be in your presence. An absolute fear of God. Jesus says to Peter, what though? Do not be afraid. That's what he said. From now on, you'll be catching men, and the end result is Peter, along with some others, leaves everything they have to follow Jesus. So here in this story, Peter's initial healthy fear of Jesus that leads to his following of Jesus. The next story we find in the Gospel of Mark chapter 4, verses 35 and 41. I call it the storm. We're not told particularly, specifically about Peter, but we are told about the disciples, specifically the disciples who are fishermen, and so Peter is certainly among them. Probably a familiar story to you again. And now as a former professional fisherman, he advises Jesus that his request to travel across the Sea of Galilee at night is not a good idea. Like, Jesus, if you're asking my opinion as a fisherman, like, at night the Sea of Galilee is dangerous place. You got to plan these trips, right? See if Galilee sits in a bowl. A storm can raw up really fast. Peter says, I don't think this is a good idea, but Jesus insists, so they set out, and sure enough, a huge storm comes. So bad, listen, that even the professional fisherman, even Peter is going, we're going to die. The boat's filling with water. We can't jump out. We'll die in these waves. There's no way. There is no scenario that is good. But where is that guy that does miracles? Oh, wait. He's in the back of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. What? And I believe they probably did everything they could before they woke this guy up, but eventually they were like, we're going to die. We need to wake him up. So they wake him up. Right? The last resort. And they actually wake him, accusing him of not caring about their certain demise. What does Jesus do? Well, he wakes up, he rebukes the wind, and he says to the waves, peace, be still. And this amazing miracle, if you've ever been in a storm on the water, but the reality of something that completely stills in a moment is remarkable to think about. And then Jesus asks the disciples a question. Why are you so afraid? To which Peter and the disciples say, we're not afraid. Not now. And they began to give each other chest bumps and high fives and celebrating. Dude, we're with you, man. This is where we're at. This is what's going on. Is that how the story goes? No. What does the story say? The story says that though they were fearful of the water, that when Jesus calmed the storm, they were filled with mega, great fear. There's a greater fear of the one who said, peace be still, and it was, than there was of a storm in the first place. It's reverence. It's healthy. This guy can do this. Listen, as much as they were afraid of a storm that would surely kill them, they become more afraid of the power of the one that can calm the storm. And what I would say is a very healthy fear that eventually gives them a greater confidence to face the storms of life yet to come. Third story is his confession. It's in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 33. Jesus is having a conversation with Peter and the disciples at a critical point in his ministry. He asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" Remember this, right? So this is a teaching moment. The disciples begin to reply with a number of things. Some people think you're John the Baptist raised from the dead. Some people say you're Elijah. Some of you say one of the prophets. Then Jesus asks this question, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, you know this about Peter, like he needs to be the first one to say something, and sometimes he regrets that he's the first one to say something, but here he actually does really well. He jumps to the front of the crowd, and he says, "Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's a beautiful confession. You are the Christ, you are the Messiah. Everything Jesus has been teaching about himself, revealing about himself, Peter gets. And Jesus looks him in the eye. He says, "Peter, you didn't get that on your own. You're just not that smart. But I do know this, the Spirit of the living God is on you. And it's on you that I will build my church. It is on you that I will give my blessing. That the power of hell even cannot come against you. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom." Peter's the man, right? Well, he thought so. And it brings about another interesting point in our reverse transformation. Matthew 16 goes on. It says that after this moment, Jesus starts talking about his soon-to-be crucifixion. So after this amazing moment, Peter is in the front of the class. Peter's the one who gets it. He says it right. There's a declaration of a healthy fear, reverence. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But this Son of the living God begins to say, "Hey, listen, I'm going to be persecuted. The chief priests, the Pharisees, they're going to have me executed." And Peter says, "Well, now that I'm the head of the class, Jesus, come here, I need to talk to you privately." Right? He says, he actually pulls him aside. He says, "Dude, this is not good for business." Right? This whole Christ, Son of the living God thing, that's good. That's good. But this whole dying thing, like, can we put that on the down low? Peter said, this is not good for you. And literally says, are you ready? Rebukes Jesus. And what does Jesus say? "Get behind me, Satan." Hear the change. What's the change? Well, in one instant, Peter's going, "Man, you do fear, right? Son of the living God, you're great." But in the next instant, Peter's going, "I think I know better, Jesus." That's not fear. It's, "Jesus, you're my buddy. I think you got this one wrong. Let me set you right." And this kind of thinking leads Peter to one more story. It happens in John 18. It's his denial. On the night that Jesus is arrested and taken to face trial, Peter follows in the shadows. And upon entrance into the courtyard of the high priest, he is being vetted by the servant girl at the gate. And she asks, "You're not a disciple of this Jesus guy, are you?" And he goes, "Oh, no, I'm not. I'm anything to do with that Jesus guy." Then once in, he's confronted again with the same question, to which he denies being a disciple of Jesus. And finally, Peter is accused of being in the garden. He said, "I saw you in that garden with Jesus." And Peter, with some force, now says, "Man, no, it wasn't me. I don't know him." The rooster crows. In another account, we see Jesus, who's being led in chains, making eye contact with Peter, and there has to be an overwhelming flood of emotion. And the question in Peter's heart of, how have I slipped so far? How have I gone from away from me, for I'm a sinner, to 3 times in self-protection saying, I don't know you? From a fear of his holiness to a fear of being associated with him. And I wonder this morning if we might have at times or are in the midst of one of those reverse transformations. Or at least we fall into the same spot of not setting our mind on the holiness of God, but on the things of self, of man. That we've lost that healthy fear of God or awe of God because of some fear of the world. Maybe even tried to manipulate who we want God to be for our good, rather than worship him for who he is. I hope you hear it this morning. I've heard it this week. Hope you resonate with it, because I think in some regard, especially in Western culture in the 21st century, the church is rampant with people who say they love God, say they worship God, and yet are more in the business of trying to manipulate God to their ways rather than to stand in awe of who he is. There's good news in Peter's story. Jesus marvelously, at the end of the Gospel of John, restores his relationship with Peter. And Peter begins to see again the true holiness of who Jesus is. Peter then gets a first-hand glimpse of the power of Jesus as he's resurrected from the dead, and he's humbled again by the power of God. Peter gets a front row seat to the ascension and recognizes this is the Son of the living God. This is the deity of Jesus is in all of its fullness. He is the Christ. And Peter is overwhelmed by God at Pentecost to become whom God said he would be. And he teaches, and 3,000 believe. And Peter would later write to a persecuted church that they had no reason to fear. They have no reason to fear those who persecuted them, but rather they are to fear God, who has saved them with the precious blood of Christ. Peter gets it right, people of God, and so must we. How much do you fear God's holiness? I hope in a way that sets him apart as the one who assures us that we need not fear anything in the world. If you read the chapter this week, Sproul finishes the chapter with the terrifying story of mice and men. Oh! He's smarter than me, so I needed to dumb it down for me. I thought it might be helpful for you as well. So I turned instead to C.S. Lewis in The Lion and the Witch, The Witch and the Wardrobe. Thank you. I was going to say that. I was like, that's not right. But it is. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How many of you have read C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? A number of you. If you haven't, you should pick it up. It's a tremendous story that presents the gospel. A great story of some young children who enter into an incredible land as they walk through a standing wardrobe or an old fashion closet. And when the children in the story hear that Aslan, who is this sought-after king of Narnia, and the god figure in the story, when they hear that he is a lion, one of the children, Lucy, says, "Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." To which Mrs. Beaver says, "You got to get it in this new land. It's kind of fun. Animals talk. It's really cool." Mrs. Beaver says to Lucy, "If there is anyone who can appear before Aslan the king without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." And then Lucy says, well, then he isn't safe. To which Mr. Beaver exclaims, safe? Who said anything about it? Safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's king. God isn't safe. In fact, Walter Hooper, a C.S. Lewis expert, calls in an explanation of this story intolerably severe. He's not safe. Listen, if he was safe, he wouldn't be God. He's not safe. But God is good. Hooper calls him irresistibly tender. Intolerably severe, but irresistibly tender. This is a God who is not safe, but a God who is so good. A God who, as we fearfully move closer, we will have less reason to fear whatever the world hands us. This